So I'm going to pause right here and apologize if you hear a sound like an angry duck in the background. One of my dogs has decided that she is going to squeak a squeaky ball, and I cannot get her to give it up without ensuing barking. The joys of recording at home with four dogs. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how the United States government incentivizes the settlement of the American West after the Civil War. So important is this settlement of all of this territory the United States acquired in the lead up to the Civil War in the West that in the midst of the Civil War, Congress passes the Homestead Act in 1862. The Homestead Act is designed to encourage people to go out west by offering a deal that many literally could not refuse. So, what the Homestead Act does is it promises people land if they go out to the west and they settle on land that is owned by the government as part of this territory and they improved it in some way. So, establish a house, a farm, a ranch, and they lived on it for 5 years. The land then was theirs, free and clear. So you could claim up to 160 acres, and in some cases, you could claim multiple 160-acre plots of land and improve it that way. So 160 acres, and all you have to do is live on it for 5 years and improve it in some way. There's no end fee, sale price you have to pay. That's it. That's the deal. And a lot of people found this deal compelling, very compelling. And obviously, there aren't a whole lot of takers immediately because the United States is in the middle of the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. However, there is a rush of people going west to take advantage of the Homestead Act after the Civil War ends, and the program gives away millions of acres by the time it is concluded in the 1930s. Now, the idea of the Homestead Act is great in terms of getting population out to the West, which is what the government wanted. But what are people going to find when they get there? And that was something that was a bit of a question mark because a lot of this land in the west of the Mississippi, was still fairly sparsely populated, at least by white people. And there wasn't a whole lot of awareness of what resources were out there or what challenges these new settlers might face. And so the United States in the 1870s commissions a man by the name of John Wesley Powell, a Civil War veteran, to go out and explore the American West and to report back on the things he found there, what resources were out there, what challenges might people face. And he ends up going out there with a crew in the entity that will eventually morph into the U.S. Geological Survey. Powell is an interesting choice. He's a very capable man. He also lost one arm in the Civil War, and he becomes one of the first white people to actually raft down the Colorado River. So when Powell gets back from his travels, he gives the United States government news that they don't necessarily want to hear. And one of the things that he says is, look, the biggest number one problem in the West is water. Particularly, there are huge chunks of this Western territory for which water is a scarce commodity. And because of that, he believed it would be very difficult for individual small-scale farmers to succeed given the restrictions on water. And so he proposed instead, he said, look, if you want to make the most of the farming opportunities out here in the West and you want it to be viable with the lack of available water, he proposed what he called bonanza farms, or large-scale commercial farms employing hundreds of agricultural workers. And Powell didn't just pull this idea out of his hat. He modeled it after existing models from Spanish colonization in the West, both in California, where these lands were often worked by forced indigenous labor attached to missions, or in New Mexico, which had a long history of communal land ownership during Mexican and Spanish colonization. So for Powell, water was going to be the big obstacle towards success in the West. Despite Powell's warnings, most people going out to the West still insist on trying to make it work as small-scale farmers. But they faced not only water shortages, which Powell had predicted, but land that was difficult to work. In many cases, especially in the prairie regions of the West, land required steel-tip plows in order to be workable. Extreme weather plagued the West: tornadoes, thunderstorms, blizzards, and also low prices for farm commodities. Because of advances in transportation technology, American farmers living in this new Western region are competing with farmers in the East, with farmers worldwide, for sale of products like wheat and cotton and corn. And that's, as we know from Economics 101, right? Capitalism, supply and demand are linked. And when you have more supply, and not necessarily more demand, that means your prices will drop. So it becomes harder to be profitable as a farmer. There are also people in the West who decide not to be farmers, but rather to work in ranching and as cowboys. The golden age for the American cowboy is between the 1860s and the 1880s. This is a time period before the significant expansion of the railroad out into the American West. And so many ranchers grazed their cattle on government lands and then drove them hundreds or thousands of miles to the nearest rail station to ship the cattle back east to places like Chicago, where they could be processed in meatpacking factories and then sold to consumers. So the cowboys were responsible for organizing these large cattle drives. And despite this arduous work that's mostly done independently, cowboys remain relatively underpaid for what they're doing. While our stereotypical image of the cowboy today, which is vastly shaped by Hollywood and other popular media, is that of a white man, cowboys were very diverse during this time period, with many white, African American, and Mexican cowboys working in the West, oftentimes alongside each other. However, the life of the cowboy is going to drastically change with the expansion of the railroad. When the railroad starts to expand significantly across the West, especially by the end of the 1880s, this significantly changes the cattle ranching industry. As more and more settlers move out west by the 1880s, both the construction of railroads and then fences as more people settle means that it's far more efficient for owners of these cattle to set up large ranches that are close by to railheads rather than letting their cattle free graze and then having to drive them a significant distance to get to rail depots. So, as the cattle ranching industry becomes more fixed in terms of its location, the bargaining power and independence of cowboys also goes out the window, as cowboys essentially become corporate employees of cattle ranches. We see this similar shift into corporate work in the West in areas of mining and logging, which again, in our pop culture, we think of when we talk about mining, maybe that individual gold miner, right? The 49er going out to mine gold in California, right? Panning for gold in the river. Or when we talk about logging, we think of like lumberjacks, like the mythical Paul Bunyan, right? Going out and swinging axes and felling trees. But the thing with mining and logging is over time, you need more and more equipment to make it work and to make it profitable. Mining, for example, this kind of surface mining that you see in like sifting for gold in riverbeds taps out really quickly. And then you have to go and dig in actual mines. And that requires heavy duty equipment. And heavy duty equipment requires a lot of investment money or capital, meaning that we have this shift in both mining and logging from relatively small individual enterprises to large corporations who have the cash to be able to invest in that kind of equipment. Similarly, in the West, we see the explosion of urban areas or cities. And even though, again, because of pop culture, we think of people in the West living in these sort of small, dusty towns where they're relatively isolated from one another. That's not true. A lot of the population in the West in the late 1800s lives in cities. San Francisco was one of the biggest cities in the West during this time period, with it growing virtually overnight with the discovery of gold in 1849, or excuse me, 1848, with most people actually arriving to dig for the gold in 1849. And San Francisco remains the major urban center and the big hub for trade between the United States and the Pacific for a long time. And then in 1892, Los Angeles to the south starts to grow into the behemoth it is today after the discovery of oil in Los Angeles. So more and more Americans in the West are not living on kind of these isolated, small farm claims driven by the Homestead Act, but instead are living in these big urban areas that have grown because of trade, on the discovery of commodity, whether gold in San Francisco or oil in Los Angeles. So this image of the rugged individual West that dominates our collective cultural imagination about the West really isn't true anymore by the time we get to the 1880s. If at any time this rugged individual version of the West was true, probably before the Civil War and the early waves of expansion in the 1840s and the 1850s. But with the rise of the Second Industrial Revolution and all this new technology introduced to the West, as well as corporations taking advantage of this new technology, the individual West is no more.